and welcome to Peace Shift, a podcast in which we explore what is needed to live in a more peaceful world. With the people I interview, experts and practitioners from the field, we look at cultural change as well as hands-on activism, and we'll discuss the interconnection of war, conflict and environmental destruction. I am your host, Nina Kouvouts, a trainer, peace educator and author.
So, Kathy, welcome to the Peace Shift podcast. And for our listeners, for this episode, I am interviewing Kathy Kelly. She is an American peace activist, pacifist, and author, and co-coordinator of Voices for Creative Nonviolence. As part of a peace team work in several countries, she has traveled to Iraq 26 times, remaining in combat zones during the early days of both US-Iraq wars. From 2009 to 2019, her activism and writing focused on Afghanistan, Yemen, and Gaza, along with domestic protests against US drone policy. She has been arrested more than 60 times at home and abroad, and she has written of her experiences among targets of US military bombardment and inmates of US prison. So, Kathy, maybe you can also tell us in your own words a little bit more about all the work you've been doing and the adventures it seems you have had.
Well, thank you, Nina. Thank you for the invitation to be with you today. And I've had a very, very fortunate life, I must say. I feel quite blessed in having been able to be together with some of the finest people in the world, even though at times it's been under very stressful conditions and often conditions which never ever should have happened in the first place. I think about people that are trapped inside of prisons and war zones. I should mention that the pandemic and looming ecological collapse had quite a big influence on the organization that I was part of, called Voices for Creative Nonviolence, and formerly Voices in the Wilderness. We had a good 25-year run, but we closed the organization during the pandemic because it became no longer possible to travel, and we started to question the method of doing as much travel as we were doing, given the looming ecological collapse. And so we closed Voices for Creative Nonviolence, and we all became involved in similar projects and have worked. I've actually been working, I think, a bit harder than I've ever worked before in my life. But I am now the board president of World Beyond War, and I should mention that as a good orientation for me, because I think that collective has a great deal of influence on the vision that we hold, which is to abolish all wars. And then I'm also very involved in the Merchants of Death War Crimes Tribunal. We are looking at the people who profit enormously from the manufacture, sale, and use of weapons, and the possible use of nuclear weapons. And we want to put them on a trial, more or less, in front of a people's tribunal that will happen in November of 2023. And so those companies are Boeing, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and General Atomics. And then I'm also very, very involved in trying to share resources, basically, with young Afghans who are at great risk right now because they had been so generous in their hospitality, welcoming internationals that came to visit them and supported some of their earlier projects. And so we've worked very hard to resettle quite a number of them in safer places. And it's been great to work with permaculturists in Portugal who have found a very fine and much more safe haven, in a sense, for young Afghans. And we've also been grateful to people in Brazil and Germany and Canada who have received others. So that keeps me quite busy, I guess. But I am grateful for time just to think about the realities of nonviolence and the needs that we're facing right now.
Could you say more about this? What kind of needs are we facing that you try to address with your work?
Well, I think in a way, the national religion in my country, in the United States, is militarism. We have so glamorized the military. We've made it seem so normal that, of course, you turn to the military to solve problems. And when I think about where we entrust our resources in terms of discretionary budget spending, over half of it goes to the military. And anytime there's a dispute in terms of foreign policy or international concerns, rather than seek negotiation or move forward as though you didn't have weapons in your toolkit, the predominant way forward has been to seek military. It seems like an oxymoron to me to say military solutions. War is never the answer. But we have been involved in war after war after war, and it's so damaging to the planet. It reinforces a pernicious perception that some people are exceptional, that some people who already have so much have a right to get more and have a right to feel great fear that they might not be able to maintain their inequitable level of acquisition and control of resources. And out of that fear, then there just grows this terrible reliance on weapons to protect what's already been amassed. And I think that it leads to greed as well. Like, well, we can take more. And this fear that we won't be the number one hegemon is very present in the United States. And it inspires people to say, well, what can you do? We have to keep on supporting our military, support our troops. And then pretty soon people are selling camouflage baby diapers, and, the flag and the military emphasis are present even within the faith-based groups. And on campuses, the young people are training for military exercises, even, on campuses named after St. Francis. And so I think this militarism eats away at, corrodes our society, and it simply must be addressed. And with it, that sort of pillar of belief in exceptionalism, that we are the exceptional ones. I remember Secretary of State Madeleine Albright had once said, "We are the indispensable nation. We stand taller than others. We see further." And that's like inimical to solving problems in our world right now, because if we don't learn how to collaborate to deal with the great threats that we do face, threats of ecological collapse, which clearly, call for collaboration in order to solve these problems with other countries like Russia and China, working with the United States and the global South. If we face new pandemics, clearly we're in great need of collaboration, not this kind of exceptional, we have to be number one attitude. And then with regard to nuclear proliferation, if the countries around the world don't sign the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, we could end up annihilating ourselves as a planet. So planetary protection, I think, requires collaboration. And this is the kind of thing that requires a whole different style of education than the one that many in the United States have been fed in the received wisdom that tells us we have to be number one, and we have a right to be number one, and we can basically maintain a colonial view toward other peoples in other parts of the world.
That's such a huge task that you are up to, right? I mean, of course, also in Europe, we have a spirit of imperialism, but compared to the US, we do see how much you are spending on the military and starting so many wars, as you mentioned. So, would you say that this is not only something that is perpetuated by politics, but really has a broad support in the population in the US?
Well, I do feel great dismay when I see how the media, which is a major education source in the United States, how it skews people's perception of other human beings. Some people are shown as human beings who should not be afflicted by war. Almost 24/7 in the past year, people in the United States have had a media-oriented empathy built for people in Ukraine. And we've seen people suffering desperately when their homes are destroyed, when their infrastructure is attacked, when their children are torn apart from their families. There's been tremendous empathy, and I think in Europe as well. And the open arms that welcomed refugees was just stunning. And I thought, well, this is how every war ought to be covered. There ought to always be tremendous empathy for the people bearing the brunt of war. And of course, you open your arms to the refugees and you don't stigmatize them or make them seem like, some sort of an enemy assault. But what a difference between how the United States media covered the war in Ukraine and how it has covered, for instance, the war in Afghanistan. I mean, honestly, Nina, the coverage of the United States troop departure in August of 2021 from Afghanistan got more coverage than the previous 20 years of warfare. And I am quite sure of that because I went back and forth to Afghanistan many, many times and came back with stories about young people who wanted to abolish war, who believed in nonviolence, who were, extremely newsworthy really in what they were doing because they were such an attractive group of people dedicated to helping share resources with people who are less well off than they were and, designing innovative ways to solve problems. Like if I could just mention briefly, they figured out that if they took surveys, they could determine who were the neediest of the widows who got pushed up the mountainside outside of Kabul because they didn't have money to pay for rent. And so they lived in the most desperate of conditions. And they would go and collect surveys and then look over their surveys and determine which women were the neediest and could earn at least a meager income by manufacturing big, heavy blankets. And then they got the materials to the women to make these big, heavy blankets. And then they'd hire a rickety old truck and deliver the blankets free of charge to the refugee camps. And these were teenagers organizing and accomplishing this. So, people in Afghanistan were, I think, almost brushed off as, non-existent. You see the same thing with regard to coverage of war in Yemen. The United States constantly supports the Saudis in acquiring United States weapons and training and how to use the weapons, or the United States kind of gives Saudi Arabia cover in the United Nations discussions. And so people in Yemen have for years coped with starvation and cholera and displacement and being maimed and bereaved and battered by this ongoing war. But there's barely a mention of Yemen in media coverage. So I really do hold the media. Well, actually, we had the President Dwight Eisenhower say it at the end of his term so clearly. He was the president after World War II. And he said to the Congress and the whole public, beware of the unwarranted influence of the military-industrial complex. And in fact, in his original speech, he said the military-industrial congressional complex. And then his speechwriter said, you better take that out. You've got to work with that Congress, or somebody else has to. But that is, I think, describing a truth that we have this military-industrial congressional complex that has normalized constantly being at war, and done so in part by fostering an almost cartoon-like version of the United States and whoever the enemy is. And, yes, there's a lot of coverage of suffering in Ukraine, but also right now we see the cartoon factor. Everybody is demonizing Vladimir Putin, and that's the justification to keep on pouring more and more weapons and escalating the weapon use, the killing, the bloodshed, the slaughter, without helping people assess what is the outcome of continual warfare. Eventually it gets settled at the negotiating table, not on the battlefield.
Yes, we could maybe then say also the industrial military media complex. To point out.
Yeah. So how do we counteract that? People in real estate in the United States often say location, location, location. You've got to have the right location. And I think in the peace movement, we need to say education, 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 and not rely on the universities, many of which are already co-opted because of their donors, but on grassroots education and outreach, and be aware of what's been accomplished in the past, which has been estimable and actually hopeful. I think that the grassroots capacity to educate people is one of our best strengths, and we need to use it. And always try to find creative ways of reaching out to people.
So you were telling about education is very much needed, and bringing the stories of people suffering really from war.
And maybe I'd like to give an example. I hope it's okay if I'm looking back at several decades. But at right about this time, leading up to the March 18th, 19th, beginning of the 2002 shock and awe bombing of Iraq, the world came closer than ever before to stopping a war before it started. And it was remarkable. I was in Baghdad at the time, and in spite of the claims that Secretary of State Colin Powell had made that Iraq did possess weapons of mass destruction, that they had the proof, people still didn't accept that. They turned out in the millions throughout Europe, in major European countries, in South Central European countries, in Latin America, in North America. There were tremendous outpourings of millions of people. It was like the world's other superpower, the New York Times said, public opinion. Now, if we go back to 1991, and of course I'm old, so that doesn't seem so long ago to me, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, I would say most people in the United States could possibly spell Iraq and might be able to find it on the map, but probably not really. But eventually, people began to know a lot more about Iraq. But again, it was in the United States that cartoonized version, as though only one person lived in all of Iraq, Saddam Hussein. And so the United States invaded Iraq in 1991, imposed economic sanctions. Hundreds of thousands of children suffered and died, and people in the United States only heard about Saddam. Well, our groups that believed we had to take some kind of nonviolent action to stop the terrible economic warfare against Iraq decided the action we could take would be to break those sanctions. And the United States government told us, if you keep this up, you can have 12 years in prison as a punishment, and a $1 million fine and a $250,000 administrative penalty. And we were very clear. We said, thank you for the clarity of your warning. We can't be governed by unjust laws that are punishing children to death. And so we're going to continue our efforts, and we invite you to join us. And we kept up that posture for a good 13 years, and we delivered medicines to families and children as best we could, always breaking the sanctions and always telling the United States government we did it again. But we also were able to bring back the stories of ordinary Iraqis. And eventually, we called ourselves Voices in the Wilderness, and we were kind of out there in the wilderness in a way. And our Iraqi friends, we said, well, how does this name translate into Arabic? And they said, well, actually, it's equivalent to a very famous poem in Arabic literature about a voice that's echoing in the mountains, a shepherd boy's voice, and it'll, echo back and forth, but no one will ever really hear it. And we said, oh, well, should we change our name? And they said, no, that's exactly what you are. So it worked, Voices in the Wilderness for this group, and we sent 70 delegations to Iraq and lived in Iraq all through the Shah Qanar bombing. But eventually other groups, and I'll just name some from the United States, various Catholic worker houses, Peace Action, Veterans for Peace, Christian peacemaker teams, the Fellowship of Reconciliation, the American Friends Service Committee, they all began to also send delegations. And every delegation returning from Iraq hit the ground running. And they went to their friends and their families and their coworkers and their organizations and in their newsletters. They disseminated education about what they had seen and heard. And this was happening all throughout Europe as well, particularly with the UK Voices in the Wilderness group. And so I think if I ask, well, how did people know enough to turn out in the millions when the media never breathed a word about economic sanctions and suffering Iraqis and the wrongfulness of this continued warfare? And I think it was because of the grassroots people who took it on themselves to say, yes, we have to tell people about these realities. And that's why so many people poured out. Now, it turned out big, huge street demonstrations didn't carry the day. Maybe there should have been much more focus on legislative effort because there actually were legislators who were beginning to panic, saying, we can't go ahead with this war. We don't have popular support. And there might have been perhaps much more pressure for the International Atomic Energy Association to hurry up and put out their report. But I think it's important for us to recognize the heft that grassroots education can have, so that when we look at ecological collapse and we see the worldwide organizing and the capacity with internet and Zoom calls and abilities to coordinate ourselves worldwide, there may be a possibility that nonviolence can push forward and do it at an accelerated pace. It's a very exciting time to be pursuing nonviolent means.
That's very great to hear. Yes, I hope so. And so do you feel that this, because you're talking about an outpouring of people, and in my mind, many people don't even know about peace teams and would consider it very dangerous to go to a war zone to help people, right? So do you feel that they really kind of, that it was enough that people went there and that they do work that was substantial for the situation that the country was in?
Well, I think we have to be ready to change gears. It was very, very important to go to these countries and bring back the stories of what we had seen and heard and form personal relationships. But I want to keep that idea of ecological collapse. It's degenerate in our time right now to consume jet fuel as though there's no tomorrow. I mean, there will be no tomorrow. So that's why I think we've got this unusual chance with internet and the capacity to have witness face to face, although we're looking at screens. And I think we do need to emphasize that. And also, what if all of those people in the millions that turned out to oppose the war against Iraq had said, and you know what, on Monday morning, we're going to still be here. We're not just going to demonstrate on Saturday and Sunday. The idea of a general strike. And that's not so outlandish. We're starting to see more formation of unions amongst young people here in the United States. And I think more of a recognition that you can take a stronger step and it may not be the end of the world. And I also want to note that people have for centuries said to young people, you can go into a very dangerous situation. We're saying it to people in Ukraine and Russia collectively now. I mean, the lifespan at the front is 4 hours. So can we put ourselves in other situations of risk? Those of us who don't believe in war making, who don't believe in blowing things up and creating contamination and destruction and setting in pattern these vicious spirals, can we take other kinds of risks? Well, sure we can. I didn't pay my taxes from 1980 until now. I have to acknowledge I'm on Social Security now, so it's not an issue for me. But I can tell you people all across the United States who have opted to live in houses of hospitality, who have an open door policy until the house gets filled up, who welcome some of the people that are considered to be very risky to live with and who often do have mental illnesses. And they don't call the police if there's a dispute. And I call them when I want to try to form some kind of a team that involves risk, because I know these are the people who understand what it means to take a risk. And now we see Extinction Rebellion developing along those lines as well. Community is emphasized within Extinction Rebellion. And people are encouraged to consider the possibility of kind of stepping outside their comfort zone or what looks normal. Or I think of Greta Thunberg. Look what that young girl did for the world in terms of challenging us to take a risk. So what's the alternative? That's pretty risky, to just let the nuclear weapon proliferation go unchecked and let all of these, unbridled militarists, these reckless people continue to govern our countries. That doesn't make very much sense at all. And I am deeply disappointed that the United States and NATO have so pushed people in Europe, I think particularly of Germany, that had made such gains by saying we're going to stay out of the war machinery. And now they're saying, well, we've changed our mind, and the same with Japan. So I think we have a renewed challenge, if you will, to put forth the wisdom that's being set aside and try to center it again. I think about Albert Camus in the book Neither Victims Nor Executioners, who said it's a formidable gamble, but I, for my part, will choose to say that words are stronger than weapons.
Right, and also with the joining of Sweden and Finland to the NATO.
Yeah, it's a heady time for the weapon manufacturers. They're making so much profit, and then they can hire legions of lobbyists to go and promote their cause. And the peace movement is definitely outspent and outmaneuvered. But I do think that our strength exists in the very grassroots efforts and creative education efforts, which often involve undertaking risk-oriented actions.
So, Kathy, you mentioned a few times the ecological crisis. Maybe you can say a little bit more of how you see that the two issues are related. Do you think that environmental destruction is a part or a symptom of a culture of violence, or how do you see the relationship?
Well, I like the word, I don't think it's really a proper word yet, but beingism. And you had used a word in a note to me earlier, Nina, about interbeing. And when I mentioned exceptionalism before, I think we have a false notion of a kind of pyramid with human beings at the top, at the apex. But that's not really true. And scientists can, develop that more clearly for us. But we do live in an interdependent world. Species that are, practice reciprocity and mutuality and mutual survival should include humans, but we ought not think that somehow we have an automatic right to protect our species at the expense of all other life on the planet. So, again, that sense of fear and insecurity and greed, and then people who are feeling that being equipped with weapons, that's certainly quite dangerous. So I think the ecological collapse is accelerated and hastened by people who don't want to think about the possible happiness that can come with living more simply, with sharing resources more radically, and with challenging the people that are so willing to say, store up the weapons and when possible use them so you can store up more. It's certainly not a good idea to use fear as a motivator, but I do think we face existential threats, and the greatest threats that we face are the threats that are the result of what we're doing to our own planet in contaminating the land and the air and the water. And if we were to defend ourselves against that threat, rationally, we wouldn't be turning to the military, which is one of the biggest contaminating groups on the planet collectively. We'd be turning toward developing intercontinental, international, intercultural agreements and collaborating on ways to get the scientists working together. I mean, if you tell a group of scientists, okay, here's the project we want you to work on, it's, that's generally what they'll work on. And if same with people that are undertaking great engineering feats. And so I think the ingenuity that's gone into protecting an elitist group of people on the planet and constantly assuring that they get the upper hand is not something that's going to contribute toward ecological survival or planetary protection. It's got too much of a colonialist perspective, like those who already have so much are entitled to get more. So we have to, have a revolution of perception in that regard, that it doesn't really allow anybody to get by in terms of planetary survival if we keep fostering this idea that there's a certain elite group that has an automatic God-given right to take more than its fair share of resources at cut-rate prices and continue to contaminate the earth and contribute toward the ecological collapse. So, I don't want to engage in name-calling, but I think it's a good idea to entertain the word degenerate in the sense of what generates fruitful, life-giving survival and what is degenerative, what cuts it off. And many of the people who are in very powerful places in our world, and not just in governments and militaries, also in the sort of influential places in universities, in academia, in the arts. If we don't reckon with the ecological collapse, then perhaps that word degenerate is appropriate, even though every human being should be treated with respect and kindness. I think we have to ask ourselves, what is degenerative? There's a writer named Amitav Ghosh an Indian author and often a novelist, but lately he's been writing nonfiction, and he's quite strong in applying that word and saying you've got to stop being degenerates.
Yeah. So yes, there are many things that we need to stop. You mentioned already quite a few. The whole colonialism and the neo-colonial attitude, the greed, the wars, the violence, elitism, you could say, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned collaboration, so I'm wondering, like, what else do we need to prevent an ecological collapse, and why is it so difficult?
Well, I'm so grateful to be getting to know more about permaculture and to see how the permaculturists approach not only rehabilitating desertified land or wisely imagining the way to create croplands, create nutrients, soil nutrients, and water availability so that they can really plan for a better agricultural future. But they also are very good, many of the permaculture communities, at mapping out ways for communities to live together and solve their problems, and certainly not, saying, well, be sure you have a stash of weapons on hand, but the permaculturists for refugees have, in fact, tried to figure out holistic and humane and respectful and mutually beneficial ways to welcome refugees who have to flee from wars or from ecological collapse. And there will be more and more and more waves of refugees. And what I found so gratifying is the sort of grassroots, small group approach toward welcoming refugees into permaculture communities. And I've been able to watch, and I know this is very granular, I suppose, but I've been able to watch a group of young people from Afghanistan who were enormously idealistic. And I mentioned the project with, creating the blankets and helping the widows, and they had a street kids school, and they often had projects to try and help people overcome ethnic divisions and gender inequity. So these youngsters then pled with us and said, the Taliban have said that we were the infidels, that we were criminal to have gotten involved with any of you, and we don't feel safe, and can you help us? So I've watched people in Portugal in particular, in a small town called Mertola, which is depopulated and needs people on hand to help restore the land and make it a lush cropland again. So they welcomed 8 of these young Afghans, and it's just been brilliant. They succeeded in restoring desertified land. They've been welcomed into the community. They have been safe, and overcoming trauma is certainly, part of the community agenda. And then they and others in an international group that I'm part of have been able to bring 17 more young Afghans to a city in north central Portugal called Leiria. And it's just wonderful to see the photos of the young people being embraced by the people in that small city and getting to know their new environment. And they'll have to learn a language and, maybe postpone university studies, but they'll get by. And we've seen that in other places as well. And of course, I know many people have welcomed Ukraine refugees, but that's one way that I see how communities can sort of retool themselves or regroup in terms of where they want to put their resources. And I hope that analysis will come with it that says, well, wait a minute, the United States military has caused a great deal of displacement and wreckage. And rather than free up the resources to communities that want to assist with people who have become desperate from Iraq or from Afghanistan or many other places could be mentioned, they just sort of turn toward the next war. And right now it's China. They're not even finished with war in Ukraine, and they're already talking about military entanglements with China. So I hope people will start to say, we can't do both. We can't look after human needs and treat one another humanely and continue to support the military buildup that creates so much wreckage and suffering.
Great. Actually, so maybe also you can send us the links of the things you mentioned.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'm happy to do that.
And I've been involved in a project kind of like this, the one you mentioned here in Greece. There was a group who, from a permaculture place, was going to the refugee camps. And I think in the end, though, it wasn't possible to host them in their place. But if you have any contacts for like maybe setting something up here, I would be interested to know more.
Well, fortunately, the Portuguese government issued the visas so that the people have entered legally. And in fact, the first group that went over already has their temporary protective status, and they have all the rights that any Portuguese citizen has. We've got our eye on Spain, because in Spain there are many towns, for instance, in the Galicia province, that are depopulated, and their university campuses could get shut down if they don't have students. And so there might be a possibility to get some student visas. I also think we have to pay very close attention to the plight that refugees experience, not only when their boats capsize, when they're trying to sail to another shore, but also when they're put into detention centers. And Sally Hayden wrote a very brilliant book, My Fourth Time We Drowned. She's an Irish author, and she has stayed in touch with people from North Africa who send desperate texts about their efforts to seek refuge. There's also a book written by Matthew Aikens, The Naked Don't Fear the Water. And it traces the arduous journeys of people seeking refuge from war. So it's a lot to more or less embrace and try to comprehend. But if we turn our backs on people seeking refuge, there will, I think, we can count on increasing desperation and increasing violence. So we can also, I think, look to some of the best of religious traditions. I'm a big fan of Pope Francis. So there's much that I don't appreciate about hierarchies anywhere, but I find in Pope Francis somebody whose heart is very open to the neediest of people, and he's convinced that the reasons that people continue to send weapons into war zones have everything to do with money. And he's quite blunt. He says, the money, it is soaked in blood. So I think, if more people would listen to some of the very wise leaders that we do have, and particularly looking into the past, to hear the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, to listen to what the Republican President Dwight Eisenhower said that was right in line with Martin Luther King's vision. I think about the Nobel Peace Prize laureate Mairead Maguire and her constant, fearless struggles to promote nonviolence, even after she had lost her own loved ones in Northern Ireland. So, Nelson Mandela, we do have, kind of bright guiding lights. And when you think of some of the more mean-spirited people who say, build walls and repudiate whole countries of people as though they are all to be just caricatured by one person. We don't have to settle for that kind of unwise and little-minded approach to how we can live together in this world.
Yes, I mean, I hear a lot of dreams in a way from what you are sharing. And I still wonder, like, why is it hard for most people to maybe even believe that it's possible, or, to start creating this kind of world that you are talking about?
Well, it's interesting, too, that really 95% of the time, most average, normal people use nonviolence to solve their problems. If a bus driver splashes you with water and you're furious that, why did this bus driver drive through that puddle and splash me with water? It's not likely that you're going to hop onto the next bus and pull out a weapon and attack the bus driver. If you get extremely irritated with someone in your family, not to say that emotional abuse and psychological abuse doesn't happen, I know it does, but quite often families work out ways to talk it through. I myself am the daughter of a person who taught in the Catholic school system, and in his day, if a teacher in a boys' Catholic school was annoyed with a student, they slapped them. Well, you wouldn't dare do that now. We've evolved to a different place. It's maybe a tacky example, but often when I'm giving a presentation, I tell people, if we were in this room 30 years ago, the maintenance person would have put out little black ashtrays on every fourth desk, and there would be a miasmic cloud of smoke up at the ceiling, and every fourth person, including the presenter, would be smoking a cigarette, and that would have been considered normal. But, people smoked on airplanes, so we've gotten past that. So there are times when social movements finally make a transition that maybe wouldn't have been predicted or seen. Once upon a time when people wanted to solve problems, each one would get a pistol, get up at dawn, pace off, 12 feet in each different direction and turn around and shoot each other. Well, we don't do that anymore. There are many ways that we still enslave people in our prison systems and human trafficking, but by and large, the practice of slavery, selling, kidnapping and selling large numbers of human beings has been repudiated. And there was a fellow named Bartolome de las Casas. He was a Dominican priest. And he started to write back in the mid-16th century, I believe, that it might be possible that Amerindians, American Indians, had souls, and that was considered incredibly radical. And then he eventually, toward the end of his life, said he thought that the African people also had souls. And actually, he was belittled and sidelined and considered a threat. But what he wrote became the basis, eventually, for the kind of language that we find even in the United Nations Charter and the Foundation of Human Rights Watch and other major human rights groups. So 100 years from now, you don't know what effect some of the nonviolent activism and thinking and shaping might have, but it takes a long time for these ideas to seep into the general accepted wisdom. And I don't know if we have that kind of time. I realize that it's a gamble.
Well, I hope that we will see this day, but it's good to take a long-term perspective. Maybe you can say a little bit more about what is important to you in creating change. Do you focus more on personal change or change interpersonal, like between people, or more on a social, political level?
Well, I don't think we ever crossed the finish line in terms of how we try to align ourselves with our deepest values. And sometimes, values change too. But I never think that there's a time when you can say, oh, I'm done with studying, or I'm done with meditation, or I'm done with trying to think and expand my horizons. I don't see that happens. And it's been exciting to become more aware of beingism, of recognizing, the life cycles of other beings and species. And so I think interbeing is a very, very important concept. I also think that community is extremely, extremely important. And as I say, this internet capacity does create new ways of exploring and being with people communally. Also, language is so important, and the limitations that are imposed because of not sharing language might increasingly be overcome as people are able to use different automatic translations. So I think we're sort of always on the cusp of something that's possibly new. But I think the group that espouses what I most believe is called the Catholic worker, and it's not really necessarily to be described by traditional Catholicism, although it upholds a lot of very traditional values. But the idea is to try to foster communities of need, where some people might have more resources than others, but we all have our needs, and try to work out ways that people can live together, sharing resources and living simply. And at this point in my life, I'm not living in a community, so it's been a bit of a departure for me, because I had always, since I was actually all my life, I've either lived with family or lived with a community. But I've become married. I married my childhood sweetheart. I met him in first grade, and he came to visit me while I was in prison in 2016. We hadn't seen each other for 44 years. And during the pandemic, I did move in with Bob. My housemates were healthcare professionals, and it wouldn't have worked very well to stay in that household. They felt I should stay elsewhere. So anyway, now I'm married and living in just a household with two people in it. But I do feel like it has helped me to focus on the considerable tasks involved in helping to resettle the young Afghans, and also plan for this Merchants of Death War Crimes Tribunal. So I don't want to, I believe you have to practice what you preach, but I do want to be honest. I'm in a different season in my life right now, I guess, but I still uphold the beauty and the goodness of trying to live in community, sharing resources very radically.
Mm-hmm. And I think there are different ways to be in community as well, right? You can live in community, but you could also have different communities of like-minded people through activist groups or any other activity.
Yeah, I feel like I'm in communal touch with the people that I've been active with all throughout the last 3 or 4 decades. And I should also mention that Bob and I were able to be the full-time caregivers for his brother during the last 8 months of his life. So that was a community also.
Yes, all of them are important. So I think the time is going really fast. So let's just go to our last question, which is, what is your hope for the future?
Well, I have a great deal of hope in the altruism and wisdom of young people who are coping with a very complex and perhaps at times pessimistic situation. But I have a great hope in the idea of perseverance, that just keep doing what you're doing, always looking for ways to be of service. But I place hope in people not giving up, not giving in. I place hope in people looking to continue personal relationships and prizing those over any kinds of exclusionary or what would I say, dominance oriented relationships. And I place a lot of hope in the arts as well, in the capacity of music and poetry and literature and film to greatly move people and help bring people beyond their former presuppositions. So I don't at all feel hopeless, but I do want to say, persevere, keep doing what you're doing. If you believe that what you're doing is in alignment with your deepest values, that's one of the greatest gifts you can ever have in life. And so keep it up. And also to be open to the people seeking refuge from violence and war. I love a line from Leonard Cohen: every heart to love will come, but like a refugee.
Great, thank you so much. Maybe, Kathy, I also want to invite you to, if you have any great story of nonviolence or a peace story. I am writing for the Dutch Museum for Peace and Nonviolence, and I'm collecting some stories. So perhaps that's a way for you to share something as well.
In writing?
Yes.
Sure, I'll look forward to doing that, and I could send it to you, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, I want to wish you well in your work. I mean, the museum is very lucky to have you, and we're lucky to have the book Engaging Nonviolence. So all best wishes as you keep your project moving, okay?
Yes, and you too, and with World Beyond War and all the other things that you are involved in. Very important work, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
And for your time as well. I was very excited to interview a person that has such a history in nonviolent activism. So it's great to...
Well, I'm glad Greta recommended that we connect. Take care then.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
We are one.